Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific and to the fourth and final session of the spring course in our Aquatic Academy. The theme is the effects of Earth's health on human health, and it's a particularly appropriate topic. I'm Jerry Schubel, and I hope that we have lots of people watching this evening for this very important talk. We hope that all of you are following the guidelines, washing your hands frequently and vigorously, staying at home, and keeping 6 feet away from everyone. If you want to read an interesting book relevant to what's happening, go back to the 1947 novel, The Plague by Albert Camus. And in that, he talks about how crises like this expose existing fractures in societies, in class structure, and in individual character. He points out that under stress, we see who we really are. Sometimes that can be frightening. So tonight, we're going to hear from Dr. Cindy L. Parker, MD and MPH. She's a physician specializing in health impacts of energy and global environmental change, especially climate change. She's on the faculty of the Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering. She enjoys teaching and interacting with students, and at Hopkins, she co-directs the university's program on global sustainability and health. She received her MD from the University of Arizona and her master's in public health from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She practiced family medicine in the wilds of New Mexico and Alaska before doing a second residency in preventive medicine, and then she joined Johns Hopkins. She's board certified in public health and general preventive medicine. Please join me in giving a rounding applause, even if it's virtual, for our speaker this evening, Dr. Cindy Parker. Cindy, welcome.
That very kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Somebody give me a thumbs up, or I guess you'll let me know if you can't hear me, okay?
I hear you great.
Okay, good. All right, so as you all know, these were supposed to take place in person at the aquarium, and I was driving from Colorado to the Los Angeles area to do this talk when everything changed. So we're currently in Tucson, Arizona, visiting some very dear friends. And I know, like probably many of you, trying to cope with these changes, the setting here may or may not be ideal for a presentation. These dear friends have 4 dogs, 2 goats, and assorted birds. So you may hear some noise, hopefully not much. But we're all just trying to deal with this the best we can, right? I know you've already heard from some of my colleagues at Hopkins in the previous talks, as well as people from elsewhere. I'm sort of an anomaly at Hopkins. I don't do research. My niche has been to stay on top of the research and then kind of translate that into plain English so that I can talk with regular people about these issues, and I can talk with students and physicians and public health practitioners and policymakers about what's going on with our global environment and how that affects our health. All right, so let's get started here. What is health? And this may seem like a pretty simple question, but the answer I have for you may or may not be what you're thinking. This is the, let me move these pictures around a little bit so they're not in the way. This is the World Health Organization's definition as of 1948. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. When most people, I think of health, they think of not being sick. And that's true. That is part of health, but then there's more to it as well. The World Health Organization has revisited this definition periodically and so far seen no reason to change it since 1948. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Hopkins program on global sustainability and health because it is pretty much what we're going to be talking about today. So on the left-hand side, you see the drivers here. These are the things that we have control over. We as individuals, we as societies, we as policymakers have control over what land we use, how we use it, what do we use it for, how much land do we set aside for humans, and how much land do we set aside for all the other species on the world. What kind of energy do we use? How do we extract it? How do we process it? What do we, where do we burn it? And then how do we dispose of it? Or do we switch to clean, renewable energy? How about food? What kind of food are we going to eat? Where are we going to produce this food? How are we going to irrigate, or are we going to irrigate? How much sort of the plant versus animal balance? And how are we going to transport this food to where it gets? These are all decisions that we get to make. Now, not necessarily you and I, we don't get to make all these decisions, although we do get to have input in these decisions. What kind of water are we going to use? How much are we going to use per person? Where are we going to get the water? How are we going to take care of it so it doesn't get polluted? What do we do with the water when we're done with it? And how many of there are there going to be? The Earth's population is a critical issue. And as you will see, population plays a big role in all of this. Now, all of these decisions that we're making, right now, we're currently kind of making them through this lens of consumerism. And consumerism is not just what do I really need to be healthy and happy, but what do I want? And, that is, let me also just mention that normally when I'm in my office, I have a setup where I can see my notes as well as the slides. Here, I have to actually look at a different computer to get my notes so that I don't wander off track. And so you'll see me sort of looking to the side now and then. It's not that I'm shifty. Well, maybe I am, but that's not the point. I just want to warn you about that. So this idea of consumerism, fashion was designed to encourage us to buy more stuff, not just fashion of clothing, but fashion of cars, of houses, of how we furnish our houses. And then when we see advertisements on TV and the pop-up ads on the internet, or we see the shoes that our colleagues are wearing and we decide we want some of those, this is all part of this very pervasive culture of consumerism that the US has certainly embraced wholeheartedly, and we're very good at exporting our culture, especially this consumerism culture, to elsewhere in the world. So all of these decisions that we make have consequences, and I've listed probably the three biggest consequences here. Climate change, we're going to talk about in a lot more detail after a bit. Ecosystem degradation, and species and biodiversity losses. And then these consequences have implications for our health. Starting with sort of the global health picture, as well as community health, and then individual health. And so we're going to talk a lot more about each of these. And then, it's not necessarily easy to make just the decisions that we've been talking about, but there are lots of complicating challenges, such as our energy supply. We've already taken out the easy petroleum from the Earth's crust. What's left is much harder to get at. It's more expensive to get at. It causes more environmental degradation. Debt, we are familiar with the US debt. That is an obstacle to new investment. If we're going to switch to clean, renewable sources, that will take some investment. But this US debt, and other countries also have big debts, that is going to be a complicating challenge to making that switch. Barriers to policy change. That's my diplomatic way of saying it's really hard to get things done in Congress. Issues of poverty, and particularly issues of inequality, engaging communities in the decision making so that they don't feel like all this is being done to them, whatever it is that gets decided. and then communication and behavior change through every step of the process. The biosphere is the part of the earth that supports life, and it extends down about a mile and up about a mile, but most of the life is even more concentrated than that. This photograph is from the space station of the last shuttle returning home. That's what looks like a sort of a comet there, but it isn't, it's the space station. But I like this because it gives you a sense of the finite nature of our biosphere. You can see where our atmosphere ends and open space begins there. When we look up at the sky, it's really hard to tell. We can't see that. But here in this picture, we can see that. And so our biosphere is a finite measurement of what will support life. And that's it. We can't necessarily go beyond that right now. Right now, we only have one planet. Other planets might be possible in the future, but right now, just one. So loss of biodiversity, I mentioned. Sometimes I hear when I'm giving these talks and people can actually, talk back, I hear, okay, so I read in the news that some little frog in the Amazon basin is going to go extinct. Why do I care? What does it really matter? I've never seen this frog. I never will see this frog. I didn't want to see the frog. Who cares if it goes extinct? And so my response to that, using a health analogy, is if you are not a medical person and you're walking down the street and someone says, I'll give you $100 for your islets of Langerhans. They're part of your body. You don't, you can just give them to me. Even if you don't know what your islets of Langerhans do, would you be really excited about selling a part of your body for $100? Maybe, maybe not. But I suspect you might be a little concerned that even though you don't know what it is or what it does, it's part of your body and it might be important. So here's the similar analogy. The islets of Langerhans are in your pancreas and they produce insulin, and without them you get diabetes. So they are very important. It's a very small little collection of cells, and like I said, if you're not a medical person, you probably didn't know that you have them. But just because we don't know about them doesn't mean that they're not vitally important to the proper functioning of our body, which is kind of, like a collection of organisms in an ecosystem. And the same thing with the frog. Just because we don't know what that frog does in the jungle ecosystem of which it's a part doesn't mean that it's not playing a vital role. John Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And if you look at this spider web as kind of an analogy to an ecosystem is a collection of different organisms, all interdependent on each other and their physical environment. If each of those nodes in the spider web, the nodes here, 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 if each of those represents a species, if we start taking species out of the ecosystem or punching holes into the spider web, pretty soon it's not going to be able to do what it was designed to do. The spider goes to all this trouble so that it can catch food. If there's a few holes, the spider will probably still be able to catch food. But if we keep putting holes in this spider web, eventually it's going to collapse and it will no longer be able to catch food. Same thing with an ecosystem. We keep taking species out of an ecosystem and eventually the ecosystem collapses and it's no longer able to function. Now within this spider web, there are some species in this analogy that are more critical than others. So if we take out this node right here, if you can see the cursor, or this one over here that's holding the spider web to the branch, that's going to have a much bigger effect than if we take out this one right here. And the same thing with ecosystems. There are some species, which we refer to as keystone species, which are absolutely critical to the functioning of the ecosystem. And they're not necessarily big, charismatic animals. It might be a frog. We just don't usually know enough about ecosystems to make those decisions about which biodiversity we're okay with losing. Ecosystems provide services to humans. Now, obviously, they're not doing it specifically to provide services to humans, but they do provide services to humans. Some of the bigger services are clean air, clean water, water in general, but hopefully clean, and nutrition, making nutritious food, stabilization of the climate. They can also provide other ecosystem services like stabilizing hills so that we don't have landslides. In order for ecosystems to provide these services, they need to be pretty healthy. And in order to be healthy, ecosystems need 4 things. Biodiversity is a very important one of these 4 things. Also, they need energy, which is coming from the sun, nutrients in the soil, and water. Without these 4 things, ecosystems are not healthy, and then they can't provide these ecosystem services for us. I'm going to give you an example now. I know that Lyme disease is not a big risk in California, but hopefully you've still heard about it. It is a big risk in some other parts of the country, as you are probably also aware. This is a great example of the role of biodiversity in protecting our health. The ticks that carry Lyme disease live all along both coasts, the east and the west coast. They live in the southeast. They live through much of the Midwest and even in the Rocky Mountain range. But Lyme disease, as you can see, is only really a big problem in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic and the upper Midwest. So why is that? In order to understand, we need to take a look at the life cycle of the tick, which we're going to go into in just a moment, and also the idea that habitat fragmentation has something to do with this as well. So this suburb has access to some natural areas, and they are probably feeling very good about that. I think I would if I lived there. But these broken up areas are not the same as an intact ecosystem as the forest was before it was cleared to put in all these houses. And so we're going to see how decisions about how we use land, how biodiversity and health all kind of fit together in this example. And these slides and this information come from Rick Osfeld and his research group. And there's one of the papers that they've published there as a reference on the bottom. Okay, so to understand the life cycle of the tick that carries Lyme disease, sometimes referred to as deer ticks, the name is Ixodes scapularis. So the tick starts out as a larvae, a teeny little egg here, my cursor here. Larvae need a blood meal, and they can get their blood meal from anything they can latch onto. They're not particularly fussy. Any kind of blood will do for the most part. And then once they get that blood meal, then they become nymphs, kind of like tick teenagers. And then they need another blood meal to become adults. Again, they can get that blood meal from anything that has blood. Any of these different critters in the environment will do. Then they become adults. And then they look for a place where they can meet other ticks. So that's where the deer comes in. And so the deer is kind of like the singles bar for ticks. And that's where they meet members of the opposite sex, mate, they fall off of the deer, they lay eggs, and the whole cycle starts again. That first meal that the larvae get is critical. If all of these critters are in the environment, then the larvae have, in places where the Lyme disease bacteria lives, the larvae have a 70% chance of being bacteria-free, Lyme disease-free, only a 30% chance of getting Lyme disease. But not all of these critters support Lyme disease equally. If, for example, there's a whole lot of these guys. These are the white-footed mouse. This is the white-footed mouse. These little scabby things on his ear are tick nymphs. teeny little ticks. The white-footed mouse supports Lyme disease very well. And if there's a whole lot of these in the environment, then the chances of the larvae getting Lyme disease go up to 80%. Now, why would there be a lot of mice in the environment? Well, when you break up a forest into smaller and smaller pieces of habitat, which species do you lose first? You tend to lose the big critters, right? The predators. And then you lose the medium-sized predators. But the idea is that with the mouse's predators gone, the mouse population can explode. Mice don't need much land at all, about a square meter, and they can actually survive pretty well with that. So with small fragments of forest or small fragments of habitat, the white-footed mouse does very well. And that means that our chances of getting Lyme disease go way up. So that was a good example of how our decisions of how we're going to use land and how that affects our personal health can be seen. Now, there are ways, let me just back up a little bit, there are ways that we can try to connect pieces of habitat. People get pretty fussy when we say we're going to level their house and replant the forest so that we can bring in the predators so that the white mouse population won't explode and our risk of Lyme disease will go down. But there are ways that we can put pieces of habitat together, string them together with corridors of habitat, for example. That's been done very successfully so that the predators then can move around between these pieces of habitat and still do their job of controlling the mouse population. Okay, so COVID-19 that we've all heard a whole lot about, probably more than we wanted. What's going on here? How does this relate to what we're talking about today, to global environmental change? And can we expect a lot more pandemics? So COVID-19, everything that affects our health everything that affects our environment also affects our health. Ebola, for example, came from bats after major deforestation likely drove them from their homes in the forest and caused them to find new homes, which were closer to human settlements. Bats are frequently implicated as part of the transmission chain for these new viruses because they're mammals. It's easier for a virus to make the jump between one kind of mammal and a different mammal than something else and a different mammal. So bats are mammal species and they're also very mobile. So they are able to move around and also move around viruses as well. SARS, if you remember from 6 or 10 years ago, originated in bats, but likely got to humans by way of the civet cat, which is sort of a mongoose-like creature. The Middle East respiratory syndrome known as MERS, M-E-R-S, also came from bats and was passed to humans through camels. It's too early to say exactly where COVID-19 began, but it likely traveled from bats to something called a pangolin, which is like a scaly anteater, and then to humans. Such species-to-species spillovers are pretty common, and to some degree, they're inevitable, but human activity is making them much more likely. So when we take out forests, we take out habitat, the animals that used to live in that forest have to go somewhere else. And when we are like these wildlife markets that are in some places in Asia, where you have lots of species that normally would not be very close together, but they're all close together and in small cages, that is an easy way then. We're sort of making it easier for the virus to jump from species to species and then to humans. So what about more pandemics? Everything that affects our environment affects our health. Loss of habitat, degraded ecosystems can lead to more human to wildlife contact, which then makes it easier for viruses to make the non-human animal to human animal jump. Globalization then facilitates the rapid spread of infectious diseases because we move all over the world very quickly now. And another thing that we are doing to sort of make this harder on ourselves is air pollution and very likely water pollution weaken our immune systems. There's a variety of things that we're doing to weaken our immune systems. So I know we're all very concerned with how this is going to affect us, whether we're going to get the virus or not, and how it's going to affect the people that we love and care about. But if we kind of step outside ourselves for a moment and think about what happens when COVID-19 spreads to India, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, places that have a lot more people, often in much more crowded organization, and don't have the medical facilities that we have. Even though we're struggling to keep up, our medical facilities to keep up, we do have good medical facilities. And so, you know, we are worried about what this will do to our American population and in Europe as well. But the consequences in developing countries are likely to be much greater, and they will be enduring some tremendous hardship. Okay, so on that unhappy note, let's move on. Everything comes from somewhere, and everything goes somewhere. No matter what it is we're going to use, we need resources to make that, whatever it is. We have to get those resources from the Earth's crust. We have to get them from another animal. We have to get them from plants. They have to come from somewhere. And then we process them, and that takes energy. And then we transport them, and that takes energy. And where do we get that energy? Everything comes from somewhere. And then what do we do with it when we're gone? When we're done with it, does it just go down the toilet? Does it go into the trash and into a landfill? Does it go to an incinerator? Does it pile up somewhere? So everything comes from somewhere and everything goes somewhere. And as you make your purchases for whatever it is, you know, maybe you can kind of think about this. And as you're trying to get rid of something, when you're done with it, is it broken? Can it be fixed? Can it be reused? Can it be recycled? Can it be given to someone else who could make good use of it? Trying to avoid buying a whole lot of new stuff that will just eventually end up in a landfill or an incinerator somewhere. The ultimate waste problem, however, is climate change. And that's what we're going to be talking about in a lot more detail now. Okay, this is a little video that very brief, like 20 or 30 seconds. If you look up in this upper left-hand corner, this is the scale, and everything that is red is 2 degrees centigrade. The yellow is between 0 and 1. The dark blue is 2 degrees centigrade cooler. And so what this is going to show you is the temperature anomalies. An anomaly is what we expect, and then what we get. If there's a difference there between what we expect and what we get, we call that an anomaly. So this is not temperature projections into the future. This is looking at history, what we've already experienced in terms of global warming, in terms of climate change, starting in 1880, when we had pretty good, reliable global temperature records, and up to 2018. Now, so the video is going to move very fast. I'm just going to call out the decades as they pass by, so you don't have to try to watch the decades up here in the upper right-hand corner. I'd rather you just look at the whole Earth and get the gestalt, okay? Okay, here we go. 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, and we're done. So hopefully you were able to appreciate how much warmer the Earth is And that is with right around 1 degree centigrade or 1.7 degree Fahrenheit of global average surface temperature increase from pre-industrial times. Also, hopefully you notice that the North Hemisphere is warming much faster than the Southern Hemisphere. And the main reason for that is because there's more land mass in the Northern Hemisphere, and the land mass holds the heat and reflects it into the atmosphere much better. The Southern Hemisphere has a lot more water. The water is absorbing heat, but because water has way more mass and is able to transfer that heat from the surface down into the depths, the Southern Hemisphere is warming, but not as fast as the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, this is a list of the health effects of climate change. In the order of what I believe, again, this is my list, from the least worrisome to the most worrisome. So the least worrisome is at the bottom, more heat-related illness. The more worrisome is at the top, stressed ecosystems, potential for collapse and loss of ecosystem services. Now, all of these will have effects on our health. So heat-related illness, greater risk of infectious disease, worsening air quality, rising sea levels. We're going to talk about all of these in just a bit more detail. Climate change is a risk amplifier. There are very few things going on that we can say would definitely not have happened, especially going on with our health, would not have happened if the climate were not changing. Most of what we think about with climate change is a risk amplifier. Whatever's out there, whatever's already making us sick, whatever's already causing us problems is likely to get worse with climate change. And often, climate change is affecting the social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are what goes on in our environment that helps us to stay healthy, like the healthcare system, like having water treatment plants so that we have clean water and so we dispose of our sewage in a way that doesn't make us sick. Having schools and cultural events and places to live. These are all social determinants of health. And again, remember, everything that affects our environment affects our health. That includes our human-made environment. So heat stress, we can definitely expect more heat waves. In 2003, during the summer, Western Europe experienced tremendous heat waves and more than 70,000 people died during those heat waves. This is Western Europe we're talking about, not a developing country. And Western Europe has great facilities, healthcare facilities, and still many, many people died as a result. The most vulnerable during those heat waves turned out to be the elderly, the very poor, partly because they couldn't leave the cities to go someplace cooler. People who lived in urban areas, because in urban areas we surround ourselves with a lot of cement and asphalt, and that absorbs heat during the day and then re-releases it at night, so that both daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures are warmer. We typically think of infants and children as being of increased risk of heat stress, but during this 2003 European heat wave, we found that infants and children were not at higher risk. Families were able to take care of them. Excuse me, and don't worry about the cough. As long as you don't touch your screen and don't touch your face, you won't get coronavirus from me during this talk. All right. There was higher mortality in cities, particularly in cities that had higher pollution levels, like higher ozone and higher particulate matter levels as well. And the biggest risk factor was social isolation. If people did not have someone checking on them, bringing them clear liquid, or not clear liquids, but cool liquids, taking them to some place where they could cool off, they were at much higher risk. In 2019, there were 3 more major heat waves in Europe. This particular map, the scale on the bottom is hard to read, but it only goes to a high of about 94 degrees. The temperatures, this was early in the heat wave, they ended up getting much higher, like over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But again, this is in parts of Europe that don't experience heat waves, often don't have air conditioning. So it was very hard in Europe at the time. And this particular map seemed to garner some attention from an astute meteorologist in France who, if you sit back and kind of look at it as a graphic, it does seem to bear some resemblance to a certain painting by Edvard Munch. And so this was tweeted out by this meteorologist in France. And I think it did sum up how people were feeling at the time as they were going through these heat waves. We can expect more heat danger days in the United States as well as around the rest of the world. But by 2030, we expect that about 84 cities will experience at least 20 days of a heat index greater than 105 degrees. A heat index is the combination of temperature and humidity. When the humidity is high, temperatures feel a lot hotter. And by 2050, 109 cities will experience at least 20 days of a heat index greater than 105 degrees. Now we're going to move on to infectious disease. We're particularly worried about diseases that are carried by insects. That's because insects are very sensitive to their surroundings. They're not able to regulate their own body temperatures. When it's warmer, insects mature faster. They bite more, they lay more eggs. They can, as we have longer summers and milder springs and falls, that allows insects to get in more reproductive cycles before winter hits. Also, after heavy rains, there's more standing water around that allows breeding sites to be very easily found by insects. Warmer winter temperatures allow tropical diseases that used to just be at the equator to move more poleward, both toward the North and the South Pole, infecting areas that people don't have any immunity to those kinds of things. And remember, all these changes, they're true for humans, but not just for humans. They're also true for every other animal and plants, that insects will cause more problems. And that includes our food animals as well as our food plants. Here's an example of dengue fever, 2013 numbers. These solid lines here across, these are the upper and lower boundaries of where dengue is currently living, and they are slowly expanding. Okay, we're going to move on to air pollution now. So ozone is not emitted by tailpipes or pipes in like power plants. It is formed in the atmosphere from precursors, nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. Nitrogen oxides mostly come from tailpipes. Volatile organic compounds is a big category of chemicals that have carbon in them and then are fumes, and so they go into the atmosphere. And in the presence of heat and light, these precursors of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as VOCs, then form into ozone. With climate change, we can expect a lot more heat as well as more sunlight. We've known for a long time that ozone at the ground level is really hard on people who already have heart and lung conditions. When ozone levels go up, hospital admissions go up, ER visits go up for people who already have these heart and lung disease. But in the early 2000s, in Southern California, as a matter of fact, there were some great experiments done looking at normal healthy kids who did not have asthma, did not have any lung disease. If they were outside playing sports in towns and cities that had higher ozone levels, they had a 3 times greater risk of developing asthma in the first place. And so that was really useful for us to know how important reducing ozone levels really was. And it turns out that air pollution makes climate change worse. Most air pollutants are also greenhouse gases, so they make climate change worse, and climate change makes air pollution worse. One of these sort of nasty cycles that we see a lot of in climate change. So this may be a little confusing if you're thinking, but wait a minute, there's this ozone hole that we want more ozone to plug up the hole. And so why am I saying it's bad when it's actually good? So here's the explanation. It is very confusing. Ozone, when it's in the lower atmosphere, also called the troposphere, ozone in the troposphere destroys lung tissue. When we breathe it in, it destroys lung tissue. That's bad. Ozone in the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, that helps to protect us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet rays. That's good. it's the same ozone. So whether it's good or bad just depends on where the ozone is and whether you're breathing it or not. And you might wonder, well, what about this ozone that we're making in the lower atmosphere? Can it work its way up to the upper atmosphere? And it turns out, no, the half-life of ozone is not long enough to do that. That would be sort of a nice side effect of a bad situation, but it doesn't work that way. It's just bad. Ozone in the lower atmosphere, bad. Ozone in the upper atmosphere, good. We know that breathing polluted air causes a variety of heart and lung problems. This was just a study that was recently done showing that even tiny increases in air pollution caused significant changes in people's lungs, caused emphysema, about equal to 29 pack years of smoking for a tiny increase in air pollution. Air pollution is bad. Air pollution causes more climate change and it makes us sick. It's bad. One of the good things about air pollution is that we know how to get rid of it. And when we reduce air pollution, we get immediate health benefits. I think probably Jonathan Patz talked with you about that during the first session. Okay, forest fires. I know you're in California, you know a lot about forest fires. Forest fires affect health even a long way from the fire. So this is a satellite photograph looking at some fires in the Northwest, British Columbia, and Washington. And what you're seeing here is smoke that's from these fires and then extending across the United States. And it's concentrating, oddly, in this Midwestern area because that's where the air currents are going. People in this area are still experiencing health problems as a result of the smoke. So it's not just where it was generated in those fires. People there are experiencing a lot more than just the smoke, but the smoke affects us even a long ways away. Let's move on to sea level rise now. 21 of the 38 major metropolitan areas that have populations greater than 10 million people in the world are located at sea level. And that makes sense when you think about how human civilization came to be. Sea travel was the way that most people got around, so cities were initially built on coastal areas. Let's see, is there anything else I'm supposed to? So 21 of 38 major cities, not only is that a lot of people at risk, it's also a lot of infrastructure at risk. And with Hurricane Katrina, that we're going to talk about in a minute because it happened long enough ago, we have plenty of time to study it and analyze it now. We learned with Hurricane Katrina, we weren't very good at evacuating people, but we can get better at that. But how do we evacuate infrastructure? That's a totally different problem. So what are some of the health effects of sea level rise? For one thing, there's kind of two different categories of sea level rise. The very slow, gradual sea level rise, you step back, you don't get wet. And then there's the storm surge with sea level rise. And we know that pretty small changes in sea level rise can result in really big storm surges. So there was a study done at Columbia that looked at 18 inches of sea level rise at JFK Airport with a Category 2 hurricane coming up the East Coast could result in 20 to 22 feet of storm surge. That's pretty significant. So we know that as the sea level rises, we get inundation of living areas, floodplains are expanding, and that can cause people to not be able to get insurance. That's one of those social determinants of health. If you had a house, you raised your kids, the kids are gone, now you're planning on selling your house and downsizing and using that money to fund your retirement, all of a sudden you can't get insurance for your house because it's in a floodplain, it's on the coast. You know, Allstate, for example, has stopped insuring much of the mid-Atlantic coast. You can't get insurance, you can't sell your house. That's a huge hit to your health because now you don't have that retirement income that you were planning on. Now you don't have maybe enough money to buy your medicines or to get the healthcare you need or to do all the other things that you need to do. Also, sea level causes more erosion, loss of coastal land. That loss of coastal land causes us to not have as much protection against future storm surge. Freshwater wells along coastal areas tend to be very shallow and are easily inundated by salt water, so they can be contaminated. There's also population displacement. That's hard for the population that's displaced. It's also hard for the population that's absorbing those displaced people. There are mental health effects and loss of critical infrastructure. And we're going to use Hurricane Katrina as an example and take a quick look at that. So of 7 hospitals that were operating pre-K, which is pre-Katrina, that's how, when you read the papers and talk to people, that's how they talk about Katrina, pre-K or post-K. Of those 7 hospitals that were fully operational before the storm hit, by 2007, 2 years later, in one of the richest countries in the world, only 1 was operating fully and 2 were partially operating. By 2010, 5 years later, Katrina happened in 2005 in August. By 2010, 5 years later, there are 5 hospitals in full operation, but only about half as many hospital beds in New Orleans as had been there before Katrina hit. 25% of physicians had returned by 2007. Most of those were primary care docs. Some physicians returned and then left again because the infrastructure they needed to practice medicine was gone and had not yet been rebuilt. That was true especially for specialists and surgeons because they need that infrastructure. Many people were newly uninsured. The doctors didn't come back until there were patients and the facilities to take care of those patients. And the patients didn't want to come back until there were doctors and facilities and they could get decent health care. And this was thought to be one of the things that helped to slow the economic revival in that area. Meanwhile, rates of illness and death still are higher after Katrina than they were pre-Katrina. Now, granted, that part of the country had some high rates to begin with, but they're still higher than they were before the storm, and they're still higher than national averages. So what are some of the health effects of floods? I know California has had many floods as well. Injuries and deaths, short-term worsening of chronic illness, suicide rates go up. These are probably not surprises to you. Long-term psychological and physical effects. There have been studies looking at people who experience floods in the United Kingdom, for example. 20 years later, 30 years later, those people have more physical effects, more high blood pressure, more heart problems than people who didn't experience floods. So it causes both psychological, which I think is understandable. It's frightening, it's terrifying, it's totally disrupting, but also more physical effects. Problems with mold, increased risk of infectious disease, and contaminated water supplies, both surface water and wells. Hurricane Harvey, we learned some new things about after Hurricane Harvey. One of the things we learned was that an additional 8 million pounds of non-permitted pollutants were released due to the storm. About half of those before the storm and about half immediately after. More than 150 million gallons of water contaminated with sewage and chemicals was released into surface waters. The density of chemical plants in Houston means that residents are very close to these plants and they got very high exposures to these air pollutants as well as the water pollutants. There are many chemical storage tanks. A lot of these leaked large amounts of a whole variety of chemicals into the stormwater that then became one with much of the surface water that is used for drinking water as well. The New York Times then decided to take a look at where there are the potential for toxic chemical sites in flood-prone areas and found more than 2,500 of them. So California, you can see, Southern California especially, you can see you have quite a few of chemical sites in your flood-prone areas. Houston's down here, and you can see that there's a huge concentration there as well. All up the eastern seaboard, there is as well. So this is a concern for future storms. There we go. So let's switch now to talk about effects of climate change on food production. We know that CO2 levels are increasing. That's good for some crops in the short term. Not all crops, and only for the short term, because then some of these other things take over and cause more problems. Temperatures are increasing. We know that plants have specific temperature ranges in which they do well. More heat waves. Precipitation patterns also changing, more floods and more droughts. These will affect plants as well as they do other populations. Indirect effects like the plant pests and diseases we talked about briefly already are expected to increase. Ozone, more ozone in the atmosphere. Plants don't like that either. They don't like breathing, in air quotes, ozone any more than humans do. It reduces growth and it particularly reduces reproduction. It's often the reproductive part of the plant is the part that we want to eat. Here's another example of how sea level rise, food supplies, and forced migration can all sort of come into play together. By 2050, Bangladesh will likely lose 17% of their land mass, and that is expected to displace somewhere around 18 million people. Where are those people going to go? Bangladesh is surrounded by India. Most of this is India, and then a little bit of Myanmar down here at the bottom. India is already a very crowded country with very stressed infrastructure. So where are these 18 million Bangladeshis who get displaced? Where are they going to go? And that lost land is expected to compromise at least 10% of the food production in Bangladesh. Now let's move to effects of droughts. We know that with climate change, we can expect more floods and we can expect more droughts, sometimes in the same places. Floods and then long stretches of drought before the next bouts of rain come. When we get droughts, whatever water supplies are left, whatever is in those water supplies, microorganisms and contaminants get more concentrated as the water dries up. Crop failures and famine. There are already more than 1 billion people that are hungry on any given day, and already more than 3 million children die of starvation every year. 3 million people, 3 million children die of starvation every year. Sometimes I throw these statistics around and forget that there are very real people behind every single one of these statistics. We also end up with water shortages for hygiene. You know, as public health people, we're telling people that in order to be healthy, they need to wash everything. Wash your clothes, wash your bodies, wash your food. And that all takes water, and preferably clean water for hygiene. Also an increased risk of forest fires and an increased risk of infectious diseases. Normally we think of flooding as causing an increased risk of infectious diseases. Droughts do also. And in fact, in New York, when West Nile virus came to New York, apparently on a barge full of used tires that came from Asia, it was during a drought. They had had about 3 years of drought. And what happens during a drought is that water supplies for wildlife are also in short supply. So you've got fewer supplies of water remaining, and then the wildlife tend to sort of congregate around those areas of water. Well, if you are a virus looking for a blood meal, I mean, a virus that has affected a mosquito, which is now looking for a blood meal, that's like the Sunday buffet, right? The mosquito can just go from one critter to the next to get their blood meal, because they're all kind of gathered together to get the water. And West Nile virus primarily affected birds. Birds are very mobile, like bats. And so within 5 years, West Nile virus had completely made its way across the United States, up into Canada, and also up into Mexico. So West Nile virus, that sort of epidemic, not pandemic, epidemic, that was not caused by climate change. It was basically caused by globalization. The mosquitoes came over in a barge full of used tires, but it was made worse by climate change because of the drought initially that was in New York when that happened. So drought, famine, water refugees, again, all of these things are coming together to cause more problems. Saudi Arabia, as an example, operates 28 desalination plants, and that provides 50 to 70% of their current drinking water supply. And to do that, they use 1.5 million barrels of oil every day. At some point, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to have to make some very difficult decisions. Right now, they are literally using oil to provide their water supply and also to buy food. I have the actual numbers here. The International Grain Council forecasts Saudi Arabia's total 2019 to 20 grain import at 14.8 million tons, which is up from 13.7 million tons last year. And oil money is being used to buy that grain. Saudi Arabia has big oil fields, but they're playing out. And at some point, the kingdom's going to have some very difficult decisions about whether to continue to sell oil and have money to buy the things that they need, or keep that oil in Saudi Arabia so that they can make fresh water. And the kingdom is already thinking about this to some extent. They are planning to create some solar-powered desalination plants and hopefully not have to use as much oil for that. So climate change and security, this is really an equation for disaster. You've got the forced migration of millions of people from all the variety of things we've talked about, the sea level rise, the food shortages, got scarce resources becoming more scarce, already stressed infrastructures becoming more stressed. This is really an equation for disaster and for potential conflict. And in fact, the World Climate and Security Report, which was published in February of 2020, they have lots of great information in that. And just so you know that this is composed of a variety of high-level military strategists from around the world, including some retired military personnel from the US, although no active duty military personnel from the US, because currently in the US there is no climate change by presidential decree, or at least presidential tweet. Oops, I shouldn't have said that, sorry. Okay, two main points from the report: that the risk of armed conflict increases by climate-related disaster, especially in places that have ethnic tensions, that have pre-existing ethnic religious tensions. Then a climate-related disaster, like a big storm, for example, could force that area to end up in conflict. Addressing problems of water and food insecurity, especially in places that already have ethnic religious tensions, could enhance resilience, reduce fragility, and hopefully prevent some conflict. So it's not like there's nothing we can do about it. We actually, can look at places that are at high risk, and we can help them become more climate resilient so that they don't have to devolve into conflict. This map is showing where the approximately 150,000 people per year are dying of climate change right now, not in the future, but right now. And you can see the areas that are the gold and then the bright red are the places where people are dying in the highest numbers. And this is, excuse me, this is World Health Organization data, and they were just looking at 4 causes of death: diarrhea, malaria, malnutrition, and weather-related deaths. And partly they're just looking at those 4 because they're easier to count than some of the other things that we've been talking about. But you can see where people are dying in the greatest numbers now. Those numbers are expected to increase considerably in the future. This map is showing the countries that are producing the most greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see this is from 2005. So China here has caught up and surpassed the US in total emissions, not per capita emissions, but total emissions. So it should be this darker color like the US is. And when you compare the 2 maps, what do you notice? Well, it becomes painfully obvious that the people who are causing the problem are not necessarily the ones who are suffering the most from the problem. So this is a tremendous ethical issue. And like I said, 150,000 people per year now, that's expected to increase incredibly by all the things that we just talked about. So 250,000, perhaps many, many more than that. Here's an ancient proverb: if we do not change direction, we are likely to end up exactly where we're headed. We definitely need to change direction. We know how to do that. We don't necessarily have the political will to do that right now, but we do have elections coming up. If this is an important issue for you, then find someone to vote for who will help us change direction and quickly. And here's my last slide. This comic was done in 1990, I believe. Climate change is not a new topic. It's so frustrating that we haven't gotten farther with it. But what if it is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So when you look at the list, all the things that we need to do to help reduce climate change, to get the climate stabilized, generally are good for us. It creates better living environment for us. So even if it is a hoax, which hopefully we know now it is not a hoax, but even if it is a hoax, we still are just making a better world. That's okay. That's a good thing. Okay, I'm done. Jerry, are you there?
Cindy, thank you for a terrific, terrific lecture. You've taken an awful lot of information from disparate sources, and put them together into a really chilling and comprehensive story. On my personal list, I probably would have put sea level rise up a little higher than you had it, since 50% of the world's population lives in coastal areas, and all of the issues of environmental refugees and social dislocations. And when you look at some of the Pacific islands, where they're going to have to find new countries. And but I want to come back to you. If we don't change direction, we're going to end up where we are headed. You had a slide early on with the drivers and the consequences. Mm-hmm. So if you were the best way to alter the consequences is to do something about the drivers. Yes. And if you had the total power, let's go down your list. Land. What are one or two things you would do about land that would affect the consequences in a positive way?
Did you want me to go back to that slide?
That would be good, although I wrote down, can we go back to that? Early on, and it had slides, it had drivers and consequences. But I don't think, I think we'll be fine. The first one was land. Oh, there we go. All right. So land use. What would you do about land use if you had total control that would affect the consequences and the implications?
What would I do personally?
What would you do?
If I had total control. Oh, I like this idea. Okay. What I would do is concentrate people in communities and cities and leave a lot of the land around those places without a lot of people living in it, so that that land can be used for food production. I would change our diet. So it's hard to talk about any one of these together. I mean, separately, because they're all interrelated. Yeah, we also change our diet so that we're eating primarily plant-based. I have entire lectures about this, but calorie for calorie, the calories in, the calories out for animals doesn't make sense. We get more calories from eating the plants directly than from feeding them to animals. That doesn't mean that we should not eat any animals ever, but changing the diet so that we're focusing more on plants than on animals. And then using the land surrounding these cities for food production. Also setting aside big swaths of land for the other species, because we know how important biodiversity is to functioning ecosystems. And we know how important functioning healthy ecosystems are to human survival. Despite all of our fancy medical technology, we still do not know how to make food, clean air, water, those things we rely on healthy ecosystems to produce for us. But so those are some of the things I would do. I would also mimic healthy ecosystems to the extent possible in terms of how to clean up our water systems, planting a lot more trees and a mixture of trees, and trying to help stop deforestation completely and work on reforesting many areas as well.
And the key to doing all of that is to keep people in cities and communities, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're doing. Last week we had Bill Blass here talking about the Chesapeake Bay region and the watershed. People are moving out of the cities and communities and want bigger lots. There are all kinds of vacant houses in Baltimore, Crisfield, and places. And if we somehow could get people, but to do that, you have to have good schools and you have to have a high quality of life. And so we have a lot of work to do to make that desirable. Energy, 87% of all the energy used today comes from fossil fuels. What would you do if you had total power?
I would switch very rapidly to clean renewable resources. I would not rely on natural gas as a bridge fuel. To me, a bridge fuel is something that you don't have to create a lot of new infrastructure to extract and use. If you're creating new infrastructure, that's no longer a bridge fuel, that's a permanent fuel. So I would just use that money instead of creating temporary infrastructure to use a bridge fuel of natural gas. I would use that money to create permanent infrastructure and switch very rapidly to clean renewable resources. In order to do that, we probably have to put a price on carbon.
But I think the other, what's your stance on the next generation of nuclear? It's clean and it's highest energy density. I think we have to keep those running.
Well, so keep them running. We don't have the next generation of nuclear. So for keeping them running, those are the old generation of nuclear. And yeah, it's probably a good idea to keep them running for now and try and figure out how to replace them. The new generation of nuclear, they don't yet exist. If they actually can exist and do the things that that we're hoping they will in a much safer way and without creating nuclear waste, then yeah, they would be great. But so far, we don't have them ready to roll.
Well, there are some in China though, and they're mobile, they're modular, they're smaller. They use spent fuel rods as fuel. So, and the U.S. just doesn't have the technology here. Food use, you talked about that. The one thing that was missing though from your diet was seafood, fish. Would you include fish in your healthy diet?
Well, yes and no. If we can stop putting mercury into our atmosphere so that it's not raining down on our seas and bioaccumulating in fish, that would be a good thing. In the eastern part of the US, most of that mercury comes from burning coal. In the western part of the US, most of it comes from hard rock mining. But reducing that would make more sense for using fish as a food supply. In many parts of the world, fish is absolutely critical. I think that well-managed fishing probably needs to play an important role in our diet, but well-managed, I think, is a key. And of course, you're the marine expert, not me. Fish are very nutritious, but we have to make sure that the marine ecosystems themselves can continue to function, because once they collapse, then we don't have fish either.
No, that's true. The United States, it does very well in managing its wild capture fisheries. We just aren't very imaginative in moving into aquaculture, but we're hoping that will happen. Water use, big issue. 70% of all the water used globally goes to agriculture. California is like a third world country. We use 70% of all of our water. Water is going to become a serious problem with the melting of glaciers. What would you do there?
Well, I would really like to have a word with the person who developed the flush toilet, and we ended up using so much of our freshwater system to make our waste go away. That makes no sense. I'm sure it made perfect sense at the time, makes no sense now. So I would very rapidly switch to some other way of getting rid of our waste. We have non-stinky dry composting toilets. We have a variety of other ways we can get rid of our waste. We don't have to continue to use fresh water to do that. So that seems like it would be a one thing to do. Pretty much all the things we use water for now can be done more efficiently using less water. And we already have a lot of that technology. We don't have to sit around and wait for it to be developed. We just need to get it into practice. So I would, first of all, improve efficiency so that we're using a whole lot less water to do what we're doing now. And then I understand California is already using, the toilet to tap, using sort of natural ecosystem-like processes to clean up sewage water and clean it up into clean drinking water again. I think we all need to be doing a whole lot more of that.
We need to do that, and on efficiencies in agriculture, and this is true in California, it's the ways that we irrigate. If you use spray irrigation, half of it evaporates before it ever hits the ground, particularly in warm climates. So that's another one. I'm sure you know this, but maybe not everybody who's watching. The indoor flush toilet was invented by an Englishman by the name of Crapper.
Right.
That's a fact. All right, population. What we do about population?
We've actually made tremendous strides in reducing population growth, not in reducing the population, but in reducing population growth. In getting contraceptive technology to women who are interested in it and interested in using it. We found that one of the best contraceptives is education. Educating women helps them take better care of the children that they do birth, and they tend to want to space out their births more. And so education has been found in many parts of the world to be very effective at reducing unwanted births.
And the other factor that's very important is increasing urbanization. As women and their families move into cities, the advantage of having 5 or 6 children to help you in the fields, that goes away, and they have smaller families, the kids have more educational opportunities, the women have professional opportunities. So there are lots of things that we can do on the driver's side if we just have the will. We know much of it, we have much of the technology that's required. And I think that the United States needs to set the example, not the one we're setting right now, but we need to set the example for the rest of the world.
Absolutely agree.
Sandy, thank you for a wonderful talk, and when we get back, we're all healthy, we'll get you back here in person, since is home in Colorado?
Yes, Colorado.
All right, we'll get you back here. Thank you very much for a terrific, terrific lecture.
Thank you for having me, and
bye.
Be well, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Stay well, stay 6 feet apart, and we'll see you soon.